Hello everyone and welcome to my The Bold Fans channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The envelope rested on Ridge Forrester's desk like an accusation. He had ordered the DNA panel months ago for reasons that now seem absurd. Insurance paperwork, a standard health screening, the kind of bureaucratic noise that filled the quieter corners of a life devoted creating garments and negotiating family conflicts. He hadn't expected the laboratory to cross-reference its database. He hadn't expected the notification with the results. Genetic overlap has been identified. Immediate biological relationship. Dylan Hayes' name. Ridge reread the passage 3 times. The letters refused to reorganize themselves into something less disastrous. His hand, which was normally steady enough to design a gown in one continuous motion, began to quiver. He put the paper down, stood, walked to the window overlooking the Forrester Creations courtyard, and then returned to his seat because the window provided no answers. Dylan, the young woman who had begun on the creative development team 2 years ago. Quiet, talented, a little guarded at the margins. She had an eye for color that reminded him of someone he couldn't quite identify. She kept her personal life private. She never begged for special treatment. She simply finished her task and left at the end of the day. Ridge had spoken to her perhaps a dozen times. Polite exchanges about fabric samples, a brief conversation after a staff meeting, and a nod in the hallway. There's nothing more. Now the publication claims she is his daughter. He sunk into the chair, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. The recollections arrived in bits. A collaborative endeavor with an art collective from over 3 decades ago. Mara Hayes was an intellectual, soft-spoken woman with a knack of seeing light that transformed ordinary objects into luminous ones. They'd worked late more than once. One night, the work transformed into something else. It hadn't been intended. It had not been replicated. She left the city shortly after the project concluded, citing opportunities overseas. He had not heard from her again. He'd never thought to inquire. He never considered the possibility that she might be pregnant. Or more accurately, it had crossed his mind once, in a short, selfish moment, and he had disregarded it because it was inconvenient. He was young, ambitious, and already involved in Brooke and Taylor's convoluted orbit, as well as the family name. A child from a brief affair would have complicated matters, so he did not pursue the question. He had let her disappear. Dylan was now grown, working under his home and carrying his blood without their knowledge. Ridge's chest clenched. He thought about Thomas. Steffi. Phoebe died too soon. Of RJ. He had witnessed their births, first steps, victories and calamities. He had battled for them, failed them, and openly loved them despite his imperfections. Dylan grew up without any of that. Without a name. Without protection. Her father was making garments in the same city while she was learning how to survive, and she had no idea. The first tear surprised him. It trailed down his cheek and landed on the paper, obscuring the ink. Then another followed. He didn't wipe them away. For a long time he just sat there, the office silent save for the distant hum of the building and his own unsteady breathing. He'd spent years believing he understood the importance of legacy. The name Forrester meant both shield and burden. It had impacted his decisions, marriages, and rivalries. It had given his children both opportunity and foes in equal measure. Dylan had not received any opportunity and had been completely absent. She had lived a life he couldn't imagine, however ordinary or tough it had been, while he navigated boardrooms, fashion weeks, and family conflicts that now seemed insignificant in contrast. Regret had settled in his body like a palpable weight. It wasn't the sharp, dramatic kind associated with public scandals. It was quieter and more harmful. The knowledge that his child had been walking the earth without him for decades. That she required things he could have provided. That she had developed her own personality and defenses without ever understanding the shape of his face in a meaningful way. He considered calling Brooke. The impulse arose and then collapsed. Brooke would look at him with the same blend of love and tiredness she saved for the new Forrester complication. She would ask questions that he couldn't yet answer. She would wonder what this meant for their already strained relationship. He was not prepared for the conversation. He was unprepared for any talk. Instead, he remained in his office until the light outside turned amber, then gray. The staff left for the day. The building became quiet. Ridge remained, the DNA results were still on the desk, and the tear streaks had dried. The following morning, he requested a private meeting with Dylan under the guise of examining a design concept. She arrived on time, notebook in hand, and her face was professional and neutral. She sat across from him, waiting. Ridge looked at her properly for the first time. The contour of her eyes. The way she carried her shoulders. Small details he had overlooked because he had never needed to look. They now felt like evidence. He had no idea how to begin. The truth felt firm in his throat. He pondered lying, postponing, or taking a milder approach. However, the paper on his desk made compassion seem like another form of desertion. "I need to tell you something," he said. His voice sounded gruff. "It concerns both of us." Dylan's posture moved slightly. Her eyes filled with caution. She'd lived long enough to understand the tone of somebody preparing to deliver irreversible news. Ridge slid the lab results across his desk. He watched as she read it. I watched for the moment when the meaning became clear. Her face didn't collapse. It merely remained motionless, as if every muscle had opted to wait for more instructions. "This can't be right," she exclaimed finally. "I had it confirmed. Twice." The silence stretched between them. Outside the office, the usual business of the company continued. Phones, footsteps, and distant laughter. Inside, the air felt heavier. "My mother's name was Mara Hayes," Dylan explained. This was not a question. "Yes. She never told me who my father was. She claimed it didn't matter. That we were okay on our own." Ridge's throat clenched further. "She has never contacted me. I had no idea." Dylan looked at the page again, then at him. "How long have you known?" "Since yesterday." She nodded once, slowly, as if storing the information somewhere it couldn't affect her right away. "I don't know what you expect me to do with this." "I don't expect anything," Ridge replied. The sentences came out more jumbled than he intended. "All I know is that I failed you before I knew you existed." "I'm sorry doesn't cover the distance," he said, causing her countenance to change. For a brief period, she appeared younger and more lost, before the armor reappeared. "I don't need a father," she explained. "I've managed without one." "I know." Ridge's knuckles gripped on the desk. He forced them open. "I'm not here to assume a position that I never earned. I am here because the truth exists, whether we want it or not. And because you deserved more than silence." Dylan stood. She left the report on the desk. "I need time. Take whatever you need." She approached the door and halted, her hand on the handle. "Does anyone know?" "No. Keep it that way for now." Ridge stayed seated when she left. The tears resumed, this time slower and less spectacular, like a continuous seep from a place that had been sealed for too long. He recalled every year that had passed without him searching. Every decision had put the known family ahead of the chance of an unknown one. Every time, he persuaded himself that the past was over. He had spent his life believing that love, no matter how complex, would eventually rise to the surface. That blood recognized blood. That absence could be remedied if the will was strong enough. Sitting in the silent office, with evidence of his failure in front of him, those beliefs seemed like foolish constructs of a younger man. Dylan grew up without him. That fact could not be altered. The years couldn't be recovered. Whatever relationship formed now would always bear the shadow of what had been absent. Ridge wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at the vacant chair across from him. The regret did not decrease. It simply sunk deeper, blending into the architecture of the day, week, or whatever came next. He had found a daughter. In the same time, He realized the full extent of what he had lost by never seeking for her. The fashion house continued to operate beyond the confines of his office. The designs were approved. Samples were cut. The beauty and commerce industries continued to operate without halt. Ridge Forrester sat alone, knowing that one of the most significant facts of his life had been right in front of him all along, but he had been too preoccupied with the known world to notice. He didn't know how to start fixing something that had never been entire. He simply knew that the tears were the first genuine response he had given in a long time. And honesty, no matter how late, was the only place to start. Ridge Forrester sat alone in his office at Forrester Creations, long after the last employee had left for the evening. The city lights of Los Angeles twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely saw them. He clutched a single sheet of paper in his palm, its edges already soft from repeated folding and unfolding. The laboratory's letterhead was sharp. The outcomes were not. Genetic markers were confirmed. The probability of paternity is 99.99%. Dylan Hayes was the name next to his own. He had ordered the test himself after experiencing weeks of anxiety that he could not identify. Dylan had only recently joined the organization, having been hired on Electra's recommendation. He was quiet, competent, and carried a restrained sadness that felt familiar. Something about the shape of her eyes, the way she tilted her head when she concentrated on a design sketch, the stubborn set of her jaw when challenged. None of it registered as anything more than coincidence until the night he found himself staring at an old photograph from an art collaboration nearly 2 decades ago. Hayes. A brief, intense affair occurred at a time when his marriage to Taylor was breaking due to prior and new betrayals. Mara had left Los Angeles without saying a word. He had never searched for her. He had never realized she was pregnant. Now, the evidence laid in his hands like a verdict. Ridge gently placed the paper down, as if a sudden movement would erase the facts. His throat had closed. He had been a parent for the majority of his adult life to Thomas, Steffi, the lost Phoebe, and RJ. He had failed them in numerous ways, choosing pride over presence, work over moments that could never be recovered. But this was different. This was a child who had outgrown even his flaws. A daughter had traversed the same halls and spoken to him about fabric weights and silhouette lines, unaware that the guy across the desk shared her blood. He put his heels against his eyes. The first tear surprised him. Ridge Forrester didn't cry easily. He had endured public scandals, near-death encounters, the gradual deterioration of marriages, and the deaths of those he loved. He'd learned to hide his pain under a polished veneer. Tonight the lock failed. The tears flowed heavier, quiet at first, then joined by a low, broken sound he didn't know as his own. Regret filled every part of the room. He remembered Dylan's careful distancing, how she never quite met his gaze for long, as if some instinct warned her against getting too close. He reflected on the years she must have spent wondering about the father who was never present, whether he was dead, had decided not to be a part of her life, or just wasn't enough to keep. He saw Mara raising a child on her own as he continued the same cycle of loving Brooke, losing Brooke, returning to Taylor, losing Taylor, establishing empires and burning bridges. He had been so convinced about the shape of his family. So certain were the offspring who bore his name. The realization that another existence lived parallel to his own, formed by his absence, seemed like a physical blow. He recalled the first time Dylan had presented a design suggestion in a meeting. Steffi had been dubious, whereas Thomas had been distracted. Ridge had stepped up in support, assuring her that the line had potential. She appeared startled, grateful, and swiftly returned to her professional demeanor. At the time, he mistook it for normal nerves. Now he wondered whether some hidden part of her had recognized him back then. The office door opened with no knock. Brooke stood in the doorway, still wearing the comfortable sweater she had worn to dinner. She took one look at his face and the paper on the desk before closing the door behind her. Ridge. He couldn't speak. She crossed the room, picked up the results, and read them silently. When she looked up, Her expression was one of deep, weary sorrow, rather than fury. "Dylan," she said gently. He nodded once. Brooke sat on the edge of the desk, near enough that her knee touched his. She didn't reach for him yet. "How long did you know?" "1 hour. Maybe less." His tone sounded gruff. "I ran the test after feeling something was wrong." "All right. I am not sure." "Does she know?" "No," he said, dragging a palm down his face. "I have not told anyone. I have to sit with it first. I have to." The words broke. "I needed to understand how I could have a daughter and not be aware of her existence." Brooke finally placed her hand on his shoulder. "You did not know. Does that matter?" He glanced at her with flaming eyes. "I was with her mom. I was careless. I never checked. I never asked. I just moved on as I always do. And somewhere, a little girl was growing up without a father because I was too busy battling over the same lady, the same company, the same old fights. Ridge. I missed everything." The tears flowed again, slower and heavier. Her first steps. Her first day at school. She felt afraid on those evenings. She needed someone to convince her she was enough. "I was not there. I was here, making clothing, married, divorcing, and marrying again, believing the world only had the children I already knew about." Brooke slipped off the desk and knelt in front of him, grasping both of his hands. "You cannot change the past. But you get to decide what happens next." He shook his head. "What should I say to her? Sorry for abandoning you before you were born. Sorry, your mother carried the weight alone while I lived in this glass tower. Tell her the truth. You tell her you didn't know. You apologize to her for each year you missed. Then you show up. Every day after that you show up." Ridge's breath caught. "She's going to hate me. Maybe. For a while. Or perhaps she's been waiting her entire life for someone to claim her." Brooke's tone softened. "You have made mistakes. God knows we have. But this one doesn't have to define the rest of her life. Or yours." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers. The tears continued to fall, calmer now, the kind that hollowed out a man rather than the dramatic storms he had occasionally let himself in secret. He thought of Steffi, Thomas and RJ, the convoluted love he had given them, and how he had yet failed. Adding another name to the list was painful. However, the alternative, remaining silent and allowing Dylan to continue as an employee who never knew the truth, felt worse. "I have to tell her," he said. "Yes. And Taylor." "One conversation at a time," Ridge said, closing his eyes. Dylan's image at the design studio that afternoon emerged unexpectedly. Focused, thoughtful, with a little smear of charcoal on her face from sketching. His daughter. The words sank into his chest, carrying the weight of every year he'd lost. He remained there for a long time, Brooke's hands firmly in his, the city lights blurring beyond the glass. When he finally stood up, the tears had subsided, but the regret remained strong and obvious. He'd carry it. He would not hide from it. He planned to ask Dylan to stay after the others left tomorrow. He would set the paper in front of her and say the words that would transform both of their lives. He wouldn't expect forgiveness. He would just tell the truth and pledge that he would never look away again. Ridge wiped his face with the back of his hand, a childlike gesture of powerlessness. Brooke stood and sat next him on the large leather chair, her arm wrapped around his shoulders. Neither spoke. The stillness carried everything that needed holding. The lost years, the unexpected daughter, the long road of making amends that may never be completed. Outside, Los Angeles maintained its gleaming indifference. Inside the office that had watched so many of his victories and disappointments, Ridge Forrester allowed himself to feel the full extent of what he had done and failed to do. The tears of regret were neither dramatic nor cinematic. They were calm, unwavering, and straightforward. They were the start of something he couldn't yet define, but he knew he couldn't ignore. He would confront Dylan. He would confront his family. He would look in the mirror at the man who had lived his entire life believing he knew the exact form of his own heart. And he would do it with the only coin he had left, the truth and the willingness to remain. The paper on the desk no longer resembled a condemnation. Looked like a door. Ridge had no idea what was waiting on the other side. He only knew he would go into it, eyes wide, regret in hand, and try, however imperfectly, to be the father Dylan had never met. Ridge Forrester stood in the dark light of the Forrester Creations design studio, long after everyone else had left. The city lights of Los Angeles twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely saw them. In his hand was a single sheet of paper containing the results of a DNA test he had ordered in a moment of quiet desperation weeks before. The figures and percentages on the page proved what a part of him had previously suspected, while the rest of him refused to believe. Dylan was his, not Steffi's. It's not Liam's by some strange twist of fate. Not a distant relative or a coincidence of characteristics. His biological daughter. He had no idea the child existed until the truth came to light. His knees went out. He slid onto the nearest chair, the paper quivering in his hands. The first tear surprised him. Ridge Forrester didn't cry easily. He had endured boardroom battles, public scandals, the near destruction of his family name, the loss of people he cared about, and the gradual deterioration of the man he once thought he was. But here, alone with the dry language of biology, something within him sprang loose.